This is what I think the Medici sculpture garden must have looked like to some extent. It was a walled structure, and it was littered with as much old Roman stuff as Lorenzo could find. And this was the environment in which a young Michelangelo discovered sculpture. The walls would have been lower, and it would have been full of 12 or 13, 14-year-olds trying to teach themselves how to sculpt. Because there was no sculpture going on in Florence at the time. Like, none. All the artists were painters and had been since the death of Verrocchio about 50 years before. I think that the inspiration for the sculpture garden came not from Lorenzo, but from Bertoldo di Giovanni, who had been Donatello's student, and now he was an old man. I think he saw sculpture vanishing, and he went to Lorenzo and said, let's do something about this. It also gave Bertoldo something to do, because he was in his 50s, and apparently he was in old 50s, because he's described as being too old to still be able to work, and he's not known to have worked in stone. So, how old do you have to be unable to work in clay or wax? Which you have to be in pretty bad shape.
Several things emerged from the experience in the sculpture garden. Much later in life, Michelangelo would be asked to design the Tomb of Julius II. And one of the features of the tomb has baffled scholars. That is, the interior of the tomb was designed as an oval. Nobody's been able to explain that. I think the oval is a nod to the rounded corners of the interior of a sarcophagus. And we know that Bertoldo took Michelangelo to Pisa to look at ancient Roman sarcophagi. The other consequence of this trip was that Michelangelo decided to carve a relief sculpture, which we know today as the Battle of the Centaurs, or the Battle of the Lapiths and the Centaurs. What Michelangelo saw with these ancient pieces of sculpture was basically how cool old things look. Now, this was not a brand new idea, but he takes the idea and runs with it with his battle relief. Scholars generally mistake this for being unfinished, but in fact what Michelangelo is doing is adapting the idea of old and ancient, which the Romans liked as well, because they were as neurotic about their lack of history as were the scholars of the Renaissance. So Michelangelo develops a technique which we would call Impressionism today, in order to combine the idea of something that's very ancient with something that's kind of misty. And from the battle relief emerges virtually everything else he did throughout his life. In the next video, we're going to look at the complexities of the Battle of the Centaurs and see how that affects the future of Michelangelo's art.